Alright, so today I'm going to guide you through the step-by-step shading process of this phase, which I did using charcoal pencils. The tools I used, together with the link to the reference image, are all in the description below. So without further ado, let's dive into the shading. And I'm starting with the eye as usual. For the outline drawing, I used the grade method for high accuracy. And also, I used a lighter grade pencil such as the H or even the HB pencil for the outline drawing. That is to help me get very faint lines, so should in case of mistake, I can easily erase and correct the mistake. Moving on to the shading, I always begin with the shadows first, okay? This is a very good approach. Beginning the shading with the shadows first and then gradually blocking the form to achieve a three-dimensional effect. So in this case of the eye, I'm going to start by shading the dark eyelid lines, the pupil and the iris outline, those small intricate details on the sclera, and even those wrinkles on the eyelid, okay? Now, any dark details on the skin that you don't want it to fade away, after shading over the base layer with your brush and the charcoal dust, now draw this dark detail at this initial stage, okay? So at least you can have traces of these details still visible after shading the base layer with the charcoal dust and then the brush. As you can see, I'm also shading the dark outline of the spectacle and even the outlines of the shadow casted by the spectacle on the skin layer, okay? So basically, any dark detail that you want traces of it to remain fairly visible after the actual shading, go ahead and shade this dark detail at this initial stage. And with the eyebrows, I'm also drawing the eyebrows at this early stage, okay? And as I earlier said, I don't want the details of this dark detail to fade away during the actual process. That is when I'm shading over the base layer with multiple layers of the charcoal dust and then the brush. Now the next thing after the outline shading is to pick up the blending stamp and then gently and gradually smudge this shading, okay? Now why am I doing this? Now this is basically to make the shading appear smooth and then softer. Now while smudging with the blending stamp, you can also use the same tool to shade the small details or features which you might struggle using the brush, okay? For example, these small details on the iris and then those small details on the sclera as well. Again, with this same blending stamp, you can also use it to gradually shade the dark values or make a light sketch of the base layer before the actual shading, okay? Now this technique helps you understand properly the underlying structure of the base layer and it will make the actual shading a bit easier for you. So now, let's move on to the actual shading of the base layer. I'm going to start with a small brush. Now this is a very effective tool which helps you to apply the charcoal dust into the small areas, okay? Now this tool also helps you easily target specific areas without affecting the surrounding details, okay? So I'm starting the shading with a small brush, and then gradually I'm going to build up the layers to render a three-dimensional base layer. Now, I'll switch to the bigger brush to easily cover large areas with the charcoal dust. Now, the bigger brush helps you maintain consistency in the shading across the larger areas, and it's also ideal for establishing the overall tonal values of the base layer. Now, during the application of the charcoal dust using the brush to build a three-dimensional form, you should bear in mind that you can't build a solid base layer after just one application. No, it doesn't work that way. Meaning you have to keep applying layers on layers of the charcoal powder in order to build a three-dimensional form, okay? You need to keep applying the charcoal dust, and you have to do this repeatedly. You need to keep building and building on the charcoal dust in order to render a vivid and a solid base layer. And also start from the shadows and then gradually and gently blend into the lighter areas to create the required tonal values. Be patient and take your time and do this shading, okay? Because this is charcoal. Any mistake will be very difficult to erase, so take your time. So now I'm going to do this repeatedly in order to render the base layer of the eye and then the forehead, okay? And then I encourage you to watch this technique carefully to get a better visual reference and understanding of how to easily and effectively shade a three-dimensional base layer using the brush and the charcoal dust. Good. So now the base layer looks solid and vividly rendered at this stage. So let's then proceed to add the dark details. So using the medium degenerate charcoal pencil, I'm going to gently shade over the base layer mainly in the dark values to basically add some depth and texture to this portion, okay? And I'm also going to darken the faded eyelid lines. Please be mindful and apply firm pressure on the pencil to achieve the desired tonal values. I'm also darkening the eyelid lines as well as those wrinkles on the eyelid to reinforce the faded dark values. Gently brush over the pencil shading to achieve a softer effect. The next step, now using the EP Penart ENGROSS charcoal pencil, I'm going to shade to bring out the dark values of the pupil and the details on the iris. Again, brush over the pencil shading to make them appear softer and then go over again with the pencil to reinforce the faded dark details. In order to render these rich middle tonal values on the iris, I've switched to the grey charcoal pencil to effectively render these middle tones. Moving on to the rendition of the linear texture on the eyelid, I've switched to the medium real charcoal pencil and I'm going to draw patterns of short lines to easily represent the realistic idea of this linear skin texture on the eyelid, okay? And also in the dark values, I'm gently shading over this dark portion with the same medium charcoal pencil to still add a bit of texture to this dark area. But in the lighter values with very pronounced dark skin pores, I'm going to draw patterns of dots and short lines to represent the realistic idea of the dark skin pores. Now when drawing the dark pores, you can vary the pencil grades, okay? As in use both the hard and the middle grade charcoal pencils to create softer and very dark skin pores respectively. Because by varying the tonal values on the skin pores, you can easily create depth and realism in the overall skin pores and texture. You can also vary the sizes of the dots and short lines to add dimensionality to the texture and to also create a visually appealing skin texture. As always, brush over the pencil shading to make it appear softer and to also make it appear blended into the base layer. Now, I'm using the soft charcoal pencil to shade the shadow casted by the glasses on the skin. Moving on, I'm going to use this same rendering technique to draw the skin texture on the forehead. I'm going to start by using the medium royal charcoal pencil to gradually shade over the dark portion to still add a bit of texture to this portion, okay? And then in the lighter values with pronounced dark skin pores, I'm not just going to shade over this portion. Instead, I'm going to take my time and then draw patterns of dots and short lines to easily create the realistic representation of the dark skin pores and texture. Bear in mind, I'm also going to include the hard charcoal pencil for softer or lighter skin pores. And I'm also going to vary the sizes of the dots and short lines in order to add realism and dimensionality to the skin pores. As always, brush over the pencil shading to make it appear softer and to also make it appear blended into the base layer. Moving on to the next step, now let's add a highlight to make the features look very three-dimensional, and I'm going to use both the electric and Tombow erasers. Also, on the skin layer, I'm going to draw the highlight using patterns of dots and short lines to create the realistic representation of skin texture and pores. Now, when drawing the highlights, gradually reduce the intensity of the highlights into the dark values, okay? Doing this will help you create a realistic sense of volume, okay? Now, this also helps you create a gradual transition from light to the dark values and also helps you achieve a three-dimensional form. Take note, I'm drawing the highlight in between and around the dark skin pores to easily mimic the interaction of light on the skin's topography to basically create a sense of texture and depth. The Tombow eraser, which is very easy to handle, can be used to create softer highlights around the very strong highlights to basically create a gradual tonal transition from the strong highlight into the dark skin layer. The next step, now take your time and then draw the eyelashes, okay? So using the soft charcoal pencil, let's draw the individual hair strands one after the other to capture realism more accurately. Moving on to the highlights on the forehead. Now let's use the same highlight rendering technique to add the highlights on the forehead. Using both the electric and the Tombow erasers, I'm going to draw the highlights, and I'm going to draw them using patterns of dots and short lines, mainly in between and around the dark spots to make the forehead look very three-dimensional. Take note, I'm drawing the highlight in between and around the dark skin pores to easily mimic the interaction of light on the skin's topography to basically create a sense of texture and depth. Also, gradually reduce the intensity of the highlights into the dark values to basically create a subtle transition between the highlights and the dark values, adding more depth and realism to the skin texture. Moving on, now let's draw the eyebrows. And similar to the eyelashes, take your time and then draw the individual hair strands one after the other to create a visually appealing eyebrows. Now I'm starting with the soft charcoal pencil, which is very dark, for very dark hair strands, okay? Later, I'll switch to the medium charcoal pencil to draw softer hair strands around these very dark hair strands to add depth and realism to the eyebrows. Use the white charcoal pencil to add highlights to the eyebrow to make it look three-dimensional. Now let's move on to the nose. First, let's shade the nostril outline and the thin shadows at the sides of the nose using the medium degenerate charcoal pencil. Secondly, let's use the blending stamp to smudge the shading. As earlier explained, this smudging is basically to make the shading appear smooth and softer. Again, let's use the blending stamp to map out the tonal values of the form, or let me say to make a light shading of the base layer of the form, that is the base layer of the nose, okay? Good. Now this is basically to give us a fair idea of the tonal values of the form, which will make the actual shading a lot easier for us. In simple terms, this light shading helps us understand properly the underlying structure and helps us easily identify the tonal values of the form. The next step, let's do the shading proper using both the small and then the bigger brush. Let's begin with the small brush to easily and effectively shade the small areas or features, and then to also gradually build up layers to establish the foundation of the base layer. This is going to take time, okay? It usually requires patience to render a solid and a vivid three-dimensional form. Now let's switch to the bigger brush to easily cover more areas or large areas of the charcoal dust using the bigger brush, and to easily create a smooth and a solid three-dimensional form. Keep adding the layers and layers of the charcoal powder in order to add more depth and to also achieve a rich tonal values. Done with the rendition of the base layer, let's then proceed to add the details to make it look realistic. Using the medium rare charcoal pencil, I'm going to gently shade over the base layer, mainly in the dark values, to add a bit of texture and to also add more depth by increasing the dark values. Be mindful and do not apply much pressure on the pencil to minimize strong pencil details or values. And in the lighter values where the dark skin pores are very visible, I'm not just going to shade over this portion, okay? Instead, I'm going to take my time and then draw these dark pores. And in order to capture a realistic representation of these dark pores, I'm going to draw these dark pores using patterns of dots and short lines to capture a visually appealing skin texture. Again, I'm also varying the pencil grades, okay? As in, I'm using both the medium and the hard charcoal pencils to create a wider range of tonal values from light to dark, suggesting the skin's three-dimensional texture. Brush over the pencil shading to soften the shading and to also blend it into the base layer. You can go over the shading again with a pencil to reinforce the faded details. The next step, let's shade the very dark nostrils using the soft charcoal pencil. Also shade the edges of the nostril outline to create a subtle transition between the nostril and its surrounding. Next, let's add the highlight to make the nose look three-dimensional. I'm going to use the electric and the Tombow erasers as usual. And I'm also going to draw this highlight using patterns of dots and short lines to easily create a realistic depiction of skin pores and texture. Take note, I'm drawing the highlight in between and around the dark skin pores to easily mimic the interaction of light on the skin's topography to basically create a sense of texture and depth. Draw soft highlights around the strong highlights in order to create a gradual tonal transition from the strong highlights into the dark skin layer. The Tombow eraser is very easy to handle, so you can easily use it to create the soft highlights. Let's draw the nostril hair using the soft charcoal pencil. You can darken the dark spots in between the highlights to make the overall skin texture appear dense or meticulous. Let's switch our focus to the glasses. Now for the very dark part of the glasses, I'm going to shade over this portion using the soft charcoal pencil. And with the gradient effect on the glasses, I'm firstly going to use the blending stamp to smooth the transition from the black tones into the light tones. And then later, I'm going to use both the gray and the black charcoal pencils to shade over this smudged area to create a solid transition between this dark and light value. You can also shade the edges of the glasses using the gray charcoal pencil to basically make the edges appear softer. Next, add the highlights using the Tombow eraser. You can also use the white charcoal pencil for strong highlights. Alright, now with the technique I've demonstrated, I'm going to use the same technique to shade the remaining features, okay? Now watch till the end to get a better visual understanding of how to shade realistic details using the charcoal pencils, okay? Also feel free to ask questions and don't forget to like and subscribe for more drawing tutorials.